Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, here in Silicon Valley. Thank you for joining us for the Lunchtime Power Panel. Actually, you've got a sort of back-to-back chance to be involved now, so don't be too passive. I'm not going to take any time up from the CloudNOW panel, but let's give it up, please, for Jocelyn DeGance Graham, and she will explain the whole thing that's coming up. It's going to be excellent.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. We welcome you to the security session. I'm Jocelyn DeGance Graham. I'm the founder of CloudNOW, which is the Cloud Network of Women. We're welcoming you to our inaugural panel, and it's notably the first all-women content tech session at a conference to date. So thank you all, especially Jeremy Gieland and our Cloud Expo host for giving us a platform for today's discussion. I'm going to introduce our panelists. We have Jill Singer, who is the CIO for the National Reconnaissance Organization. We have Melissa Siems, Senior Director at McAfee. We have Kristin Lovejoy, who is the CSO for IBM. And we also have Jamie Dos Santos, who's the President of Terremark Data. For the format of today's session, what we're going to be doing is Jill Singer will walk us first through an overview of the security landscape from the customer perspective. From there, we'll go ahead and open up the discussion to our other panelists, and we'll be also taking questions from the audience. So we can kick off some questions and get some involvement. So I'll turn it over to Jill.
Great. Thanks, Jocelyn, and thanks to everybody for being here. What I want to do first is very briefly walk you through the results of a cloud security lessons learned paper that Jamie and I wrote for the AFCEA Cyber Committee. AFCEA is the Armed Forces Communications Engineering Association, if you are familiar with them. We just published this paper maybe in September, and so it's very recent, and we've been shopping it around prior to the publication of it, as well as since we have published it, to audiences to get feedback from the audiences. We're now preparing, I think we just got a task from AFCEA to refresh the paper in about 6 months. So you'll see us produce a new set of security lessons learned or a new set of cloud lessons learned in a few months. So very briefly, you all know this, there are different kinds of clouds. This is just from NIST. But what I want to put up here for you, because Jamie's going to talk to it a little bit later on, is that there's also the technical definition of cloud, not the puffy white thing, but actually the real layers and the real capabilities, the hardware, the software that goes into making a cloud. Each of these elements present some security challenges, and they also present some opportunities to further improve the security of the cloud. But as I mentioned, Jamie will walk through that in more detail in a few moments. 3 myths that we talk about in the paper are really that you can't see inside the cloud because somebody else is running it for you and you don't know what's there, like a black box. The other one is that it's all outsourced, and so as a customer, the myth is that you feel like you don't have control over what's happening in the cloud. You actually don't know where your data is located at any point in time. And then finally, a third one is that you have a workforce that's already taxed, and here comes this cloud thing that changes all the time. How in the world will your workforce really keep up with what's happening there? In the paper, we spend a lot of time going through 3 key features that we think cloud actually gives us a better understanding of security. Those features are visibility, lots of sensor points inside the cloud when you look at all the layers of it. Those sensor points can be used to your advantage to gain knowledge. Collaboration we've seen improve with cloud computing, and I think, I represent federal space, Jamie represents the commercial space, and just the fact that we wrote this paper together is indicative of private-public partnerships that are focused on making sure we all understand what's happening with security and with cloud security in particular. We've also seen that the engagements we've had are actually driving newer solutions and better solutions. You've seen those vendors on the floor that represent new ideas and new understanding on how to secure the cloud. And then finally, on the workforce, one of the things that the paper really highlights is that yesterday's IT workforce doesn't necessarily work so well in the future for cloud, and you really need a workforce that's a unique blend of information technology and information security. So that person who is coming out with a double E or a CE or something, they will know and need to know more about security than they ever have before. Each of the next 3 slides I'm not really going to walk through in too much detail. We'll just have them up here for reference if you want to know things specific to the visibility that's offered in cloud, more examples of the actual collaboration. I will give a pat on the back to NIST one more time here, and FedRAMP, which is coming out as well. There have been a lot of jump starts for the federal government in trying to get us all on the same set of standards for cloud and for cloud security. And then finally on the workforce, I spent some time on this just a moment ago, but it really is that the future workforce has to be a blend, can't just be the traditional IT. And then this slide, Jamie is going to get to in a moment, so I'll just leave it up for right now, if that's okay with you.
Sure,
then
thanks.
you can get to that.
Okay,
back to you, Jocelyn.
Great. We're going to start with some of the big picture questions on security that I'm going to address to the panel. And the first is, how do you know that your cloud is secure?
Since
Does
I just
anybody
talked,
wanna
I'm
grab
going
that?
to pass it over to you, Kristin.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. Pass it to somebody.
That's
My bad,
fine.
Melissa.
So, by the way, for those of you who don't know, CSO is the Chief Security Officer. So my job at IBM is to actually secure our cloud and to provide guidance as to what we need to do to secure the cloud we deliver to others. So on the question of how do you know your cloud is secure, I'm going to use a practical analogy. And this is the way I like to describe it to the developers who are developing images to put on our cloud. So think about the cloud as being like this massive hotel, lots and lots and lots of rooms. And in this hotel, you have thousands of clients, and of those clients, about 10% of the clients have bubonic plague. So now I want you to think about this hotel. How do you know that the hotel is okay, that you're not going to get bubonic plague from the guests? And the answer is good hygiene, right? The hotel, you want to make sure that it has really good housekeeping. Same concept applies to the cloud. From my perspective, everything you were saying about a cloud being more secure is absolutely right. Day 1. Day 5, different story. If there isn't appropriate hygiene and a way to check the hygiene associated with the images that have been deployed, all bets are off. It's a different story.
Agreed, and I think that there's standards in place today, like ISO has a set of standards around controls that people are applying to clouds, but that's really an annual audit. So I think a way to also see whether or not your hygiene continues to be clean as, all the technologies inside of the cloud change on a daily basis is also looking at the technology and being able to scan that technology and provide that visibility in terms of has the environment changed from one day to the next. So it's really being able to have that transparency available.
Yeah.
Jamie?
So I'm going to add just a few more comments. So if we kind of take a look at the graph that Jill left up for us, it really shows just how tough your job is when this is the real infrastructure that goes into a cloud. And so you have, and a lot of us know this, you have handheld devices, you could have satellite, IP, coming in, wireless, a whole integration of different networks coming into the infrastructure. And so if you start with good governance of who actually has the ability and the authority to access the data, and compliance, meaning you are changing your passwords and things like that, that's good hygiene to start with an infrastructure. But the truth of the matter is the cloud, just like traditional IT infrastructure, so running data centers and regular co-location with servers and routers and things like that, there are points inside that enterprise, if you will, where you have an opportunity to collaborate all of the different alarmings that go within that enterprise. And so traditionally in IT, you have islands in many cases of different applications, different groups, especially in the .gov and the .mil world, even in the .com world and some banking and healthcare. You have folks that are operating certain applications in an environment. And so they don't get the ability or the better part of the overall good of the environment because they're only looking at their own. And so in this type of infrastructure and environment, you actually have, so you have the handheld devices that would be just if you consider it a filter. The network layer, you are going to have alarming and you're going to be looking for 0 days and malware and things like that at the network layer. When you get into the infrastructure, we do have routers and switchers inside the cloud. So you have the opportunity to do that also, but the truth is that that is only going to get you so far. And so because it is a shared environment, even in a private cloud, you're sharing data from one big enterprise. If you are not doing, and we can talk about disruptive technologies and things like that as we're all up here a little bit longer, but if you're not doing a memory forensic type approach to that infrastructure, then it really could be exactly what you're saying. You know, it could be on day 5 a lot worse than it was on day 1. And so there are challenges and things that you've got to do to make sure that you're protecting the cloud, but it is absolutely a better opportunity for you to correlate all of those alarms and know your environment as its entirety and understand the posture of what's going on in the cloud. So I have one very quick example, not so death-threatening as the plague, but something very recent that happened in a cloud, and I can't say names and providers, but so there was great visibility in the infrastructure. They knew that there had been a breach and that the exfiltration of the email was going to happen. All right, so that's fantastic. You know, you don't want to find out 3 months later and then try and figure out what was taken, right? So they knew up front, but the challenge was that the processes, the access list and things like that, the processes were not in place between the customer and the cloud provider to stop that exfiltration. And so although they knew it was going to happen, it happened. So there's still advantages, yes, they knew, but they didn't stop it. There was not the right process in place to shut the port down for the exfiltration not to take place.
So this next question actually builds on that, and that is, breaches seem to be everywhere in the news. And Kristin, maybe you can help us with this one. Have the breaches actually increased due to cloud deployment in the cloud environment?
So that's it. Am I on?
Are you mine?
I'm on? Yeah? Okay, sorry. You know, it's always, in today's environment, there are a couple things that are happening. One is more people are actually talking about breaches than ever before, and we're more aware of breaches than ever before. There's a second piece to this, which is the SEC has come out with new guidance that public companies actually have to disclose cyber events, something that we've known is going to happen for a long time, so we're getting ourselves prepared. So you're hearing about more issues generally. Now, if you're going to ask me, do we have more issues associated with cloud infrastructure than we do with the ordinary infrastructure, the traditional? The answer is yes. I do see an increased number of issues. Now, what happens, you know, and the reason why we have more issues is because it's unbelievably easy to spin up a new image. It's unbelievably easy to deliver a new service. What happens, though, is that, and we'll talk a little bit about training, I hope, at some point, what happens is that the people that are doing it don't recognize, they're not security experts, they're developers. They don't realize what they're doing. So they put up an image in the internet, they put up a web server service, and within 7 minutes, and we've timed this, within 7 minutes, that image is compromised and it's attacking a third party. So it's not, the issue with cloud is just the easiness with which we made it possible for people to actually innovate has also made it possible for us to become compromised. And so therefore, you know, my recommendation to everybody is it's a combination of technology and education, because those that are involved in cloud, developing cloud applications, have to be aware of the risk associated with doing that.
Okay, great. Do any of the other panels have anything to add on that point? Okay. We want this to be an interactive session, so if anybody, we're not going to hold questions to the end. So Jeremy's got some microphones if anybody wants to.
Great. That's what we like. Hand went straight up within milliseconds.
Thank you. I got a very simple question. From your perspective and your experiences, what type of images do you think gets compromised so quickly? Like you mentioned that, you know, in like less than 7 minutes. So I'm trying to understand that, you know, when I am spinning up images on the web, what kind of precautions I can take to avoid such an incident?
Well, the number one thing that I see being attacked is SSH. That the developers, what will happen is they spin up the image, and then what they'll do is they'll use default passwords, weak passwords, or alternatively, they'll actually weaken the passwords that were associated with that image. So that's the number one compromise. It's just really basic stuff. You know, web server services are always being exploited. You know, it's very, very easy to exploit a web service. So, you know, what I would say is, it's not, what's being exploited is really nothing different than what gets exploited in a traditional enterprise. It just gets exploited more quickly.
I'd like to just add a little bit to that. So in addition to your answer, which I think is spot on, what we've seen when you have folks that are migrating data over into the cloud is that, number one, there's some good things about that, right? There's a chance to do an inventory check and make sure that you're aware of all the applications that you had in the old environment and move them over and, only move over the ones that you want to keep in the new environment. But we are also seeing that as the data is being migrated over into the cloud, so are all of the issues that were already in the old environment. So there's the good side of that and the bad side of that. One is it's a great time to clean your act up. But if you don't do that properly, you're just going to be importing into the cloud, which will affect many others in that environment, what you had in your old environment ends. So we're even seeing it at the application layer.
Okay. Question from the farthest reaches of the room, look.
Hi, Ken Rutsky. Given what you were just saying about developers deploying quickly, do you see security teams integrating into a DevOps type environment, and how do you see that maturing over time?
I can talk about it from a federal perspective, from a government perspective. We absolutely do have security teams that might organizationally exist with our Office of Security are embedded now with our operations team so that they are side by side. And in other environments, we actually are changing what looks like the traditional network ops floor to really be a mixture of one organization with different skill sets so that they're able to identify a potential breach or issue as well as correct it very quickly, take whatever action is necessary to do a corrective measure. We recently just went through a test of our computer incident response team. It was a purposeful test where we posed a potential piece of malware, and we did not tell them we were doing it. Usually we do. And we just watched for their reaction. And to our great benefit and our great pleasure, they were really rapid and fast on identifying that we had a potential, well, they thought it was a real breach, and really quick at shutting it down so that it wouldn't further propagate itself across our network. So it's a combination of changing the workforce to have them right there together, as well as testing them and trying them out and making sure that they're capable of responding in the manner that is needed.
Yeah, it's also the skill set of the workforce that's there. It's not your traditional IT workforce that we used to have in Colo.
As a security vendor, we're seeing our enterprise customers more and more interested in application-to-application security. So going beyond just,
that was what I was suggesting earlier.
Yeah. Definitely coming to us and looking for that type of solution to secure cloud APIs, for example.
I think everybody's posture has to be that as much as you do at the network and the handheld devices and at all of those places, I think your posture, and to Jill's point, is that you have to be expecting the worst. You have to believe that, I don't know anybody in a computing environment that can say that 100% they know that that environment is secure. And so you have to be prepared to remediate as quickly as possible.
Another question from the furthest outreaches of the room at the back there.
Good afternoon. I'm wondering if the panelists can comment on the notion of third-party disclosure, blind subpoena. How much of a concern should my organization have about this notion of my information being disclosed unbeknownst to me?
Can you repeat the question? We couldn't hear it that well. Jocelyn, can you repeat it?
It's a question on third-party exposure and how much remediation would be available to him. Is that correct?
Specifically blind subpoena, and so
a subpoena, so legal. So if you're, so it goes to a public cloud. So not for me to answer.
Well, I mean, I can answer a little bit of that. First of all, you need to make sure that your provider, whoever it is, knows exactly where your data is, and this may be one of the questions that we were talking about earlier. There's talk about maybe tagging your data and if there's a need to do that. Some providers know exactly where your data is. I know in our case we do. And so some of it has to do with, I can tell you in firsthand cases with us, with the FBI, is, educating them that they don't have to come in and take the whole infrastructure that, if you can show and prove that you know where your customer's data is, that it's just, only applicable to that particular customer and not the entire infrastructure.
The biggest issue we see is really geopolitical, in so much that there are certain nation states that
Absolutely.
don't respect the same rule of law that we have here in the States. So, for instance, in certain nation states, there is no concept of that the corporation owns the data. The sense is we have, from a search and seizure perspective, we can go in, we can get it whenever we want to get it. So from a due diligence perspective, when you're looking at cloud providers, you really need to think about where are they located, where are the data centers located physically, because the rule of law is really an important consideration on the disclosure piece.
I'm going to ask Melissa this next question. Enterprise still seems very hesitant to adopt cloud. And in some cases, to alleviate fears, or maybe under what circumstances, would you ever recommend to a customer that they move their most sensitive data to the cloud? Or what's kind of the best practice at this point?
Well, as being a security vendor, we get this question a lot. And it's really up to the risk profile of the customer. We definitely have enterprise customers that are doing a hybrid environment. So they have a public cloud and a private cloud, and there's data being exchanged between the two. So perhaps they keep their sensitive data inside of their private cloud or inside of their own data center, and then exposing some of that data or pieces of that data to the public cloud for that exchange of information. And I think that's perfectly acceptable. We run across small and medium-sized businesses that want to put everything in the cloud. So I think it's just up to the individual organization and how they see fit. As McAfee, we actually do our own hybrids. We have public cloud applications, and we have our own data centers as well. I think it's personally perfectly reasonable.
And I know, Jocelyn, later on we had a question on the list that we want to talk about a little bit more about the data, and it seems appropriate right now to do it. From our perspective, we're obviously a member of the intelligence community, and so not looking at the public cloud as a place where we're going to put our data. But even when we think about a shared cloud for the intelligence community, we will look at encrypting our data as we put it into our shared cloud. And even very sensitive data in our own private cloud, we're going to encrypt it. And I think that that will become more commonplace in the public cloud space in the future. There is still a computer science challenge. We don't yet have encryption technologies and key management capabilities that will be able to keep up with the volumes of data. So we have to solve that. Our prediction is that maybe it's 5 or 6 years away from really being solved at the speeds that we need. But the public cloud offerings, as well as the privacy of data, I think will drive the industry to solve that computer science dilemma and give us capabilities for encryption and key management that scale to big enterprise requirements.
Yeah, we have a lot of enterprise customers that are keenly interested in that solution in the private sector space. Coming to us and saying, we want to encrypt data that is going into Salesforce.com, for example. So that's definitely an area as a vendor we're looking at how can we help fix that problem.
We have a question right by the camera there.
Yeah, so from your years of experiences, what's the top challenging from like a security perspective, and what's your vision for the future of security solutions? Thanks.
Could you hear?
Top challenge.
Top challenge and vision for the future. Top challenge within all of them.
So I'd say that there are two major challenges that I see. One is on the developer education. Again, going back to that, I can't underscore enough how important it is to assure that any of the developers that are participating in this environment are certified, they know what they're doing, they know how they're doing it, etc. So that's one challenge, is the human factor. The second challenge is just from a reality check that the technologies, the security technologies have not necessarily, that we've built for the infrastructure, haven't necessarily evolved to a point where they're robust enough, frankly, to manage the cloud infrastructure for many organizations. What I see is that, for instance, if I were to ask you, does your cloud have a tool which allows you, that there's an agent that resides at the image and will tell you about the configuration and whether or not there's been configuration drift? I can tell you that I can guess that most of you sitting here are saying, I don't have that tool. So the challenge is just that with the ubiquity of the cloud technologies out there, there's still no consistent security platforms or technologies that can be applied to these ubiquitous structures and give us sort of that basic perspective, that I need, which is, looking at the vulnerabilities associated with the infrastructure and understanding what I need to sort of plug first.
I think another challenge going beyond just the developer is just educating the whole workforce, right? Because consumerization of IT is not just about bringing your iPad into your environment, it's also using, I use Dropbox to share music with my friends. Why can't I use Dropbox to share documents with a vendor outside my organization? And so how does IT address that use case and make sure that those documents are secure and being shared with the appropriate people?
For the next question, let's do a 360. We can start with Jamie and then work down the panel. Okay, should all cloud providers have the ability to return all original and copied forms of data to their customers at the close of that business relationship?
Okay, it's a great question. And so there's a lot of ways of answering that. Number one is, if you, as the end user, want your data, then you need to make sure that you have the right processes in place to make sure that you can get your data back. And so if you are using a cloud provider for infrastructure as a service, it's not up to that provider to make sure that you get your data back. You have SANs, you have the ability to store it, you have the ability to copy it. I highly suggest that if it's data that you want back, that you need to do that. And so that'll be some of the lessons learned as folks move over to the cloud, that you've got to think through all that stuff. I will tell you in our case that when a customer either has resources, an R&D project maybe, and they're spun up, and then when they spin them down, when they leave, those resources are zeroed. It's a term that we use that means that that customer is gone. And so as a resource provider, I want those resources for somebody else. And so I eliminate that data. It's gone. It's zeroed. I have the ability to prove to you that there's no residue of the data and that it really is gone from a proprietary standpoint, privacy issues and things like that. But if you want your data back, you can absolutely have it, but you need to make sure that you have all the processes in place to copy it or do whatever it is that you need to do for the data that you are concerned about getting back.
Great. Kristin, do you want to share?
No, I think the point you were making, which is data expunging, is more important than, being able to get the original copy. And
yes.
From our perspective at least, we've got storage technologies that we can put in place. The question is, what are they doing with it when I'm no longer a client? So.
Yeah. Anything else? Okay. Jill, before you answer, I have another question so we can combine these. And that is, should cloud service providers have administrative access to customer data hosted in the cloud? So maybe combining your answers to those two questions.
Okay. It depends on the application that you have in the cloud and what you're really asking your provider to do for you. And so as you move up and as cloud services move up from infrastructure as a service to platform as a service to software as a service, your business may require a relationship with a provider that necessarily gives them admin rights to your data. Make sure that's a conscious decision that your organization is making. Generally speaking, I am not a fan of the third party having access to the actual data itself for any host of reasons. You can pick a compliance multi-letter acronym if you'd like, whether it's FISMA, HIPAA, SOX, or something. But that data and the responsibility of that data stays with the corporation and stays with the company. And if you ever doubt that your provider may accidentally give it away or purposely give it away from an insider threat perspective, then no, they shouldn't have admin rights to that data. If you need them to do something else with that data, I'll take you right back to the encryption conversation, secure it. And then they can move it around and do certain things with it without actually seeing the data itself. The data is your intellectual property and it is your value proposition in whatever business you're in. So it deserves utmost protection.
Are there any questions from the audience that you've been holding? Anybody, GCB?
See, they know how to catch my eye, and there
Jeremy,
they
there's
are.
one over here.
Okay, I'm going to do him first, so look, because I can see him. And then tell me where.
Where was my other one?
So I was just curious,
this whole expo is an introduction to the cloud for me. And I was just wondering, are there any standards for cloud security, or are there any standards being developed that might?
Yeah, do you want me to take that first? Yeah. Okay. So, and so depending on who your end user is, they're following some kind of security standard to deal with the data that they've got, right? So you're either HIPAA, FISMA, I mean, you know, depending on what market, whether it's healthcare, whether it's patient records for, or banking. In the government sector, you have DIACAP certified, you know, which is DoD. You have FISMA high, moderate, low, which is more on the .gov side. And so for us, as an infrastructure provider, I need you to tell me what I need to be compliant with in the infrastructure that I'm holding that data. And so I am, and so what happens is, as an end user, if you're a .gov and you come in on my infrastructure, then your security folks will come over and they will certify the infrastructure to be FISMA moderate for this particular application or enterprise that came over, or FISMA high or DIACAP. So there is a CNA process that's done by the end user in many cases when they come over to the infrastructure.
Yeah, and there are some third-party organizations like the Cloud Security Alliance that have actually developed a set of, you know, good practices for, you know, managing cloud security. We're in early days, though. You know, IBM, I know, as an example, has published, I think, with a number of other third-party organizations, something called the Secure Engineering Framework, which is all about, you know, how do you build and how do you manage a more secure cloud. In fact, I think we co-authored it maybe with
Intel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so but there are a number of, you know, third-party assets. You know, ISO, for instance, is also working on a set of standards that one can use. You know, the reality is you can start with your infrastructure standards and then think about the cloud nuances and build on top of that. So I don't think you have to sort of reinvent the wheel when you're looking at standards, but that said, you do have to think about those nuances.
Yeah, they're good baselines to follow.
Yeah, I think there's one more thing I would add on the standards conversation. It's not directed solely at cloud security, but NIST has come out with something called SAJAC, which is the Standards Acceleration for the Jumpstart of the Adoption of Cloud Computing, SAJACC, SAJAC. And that actually demonstrates, again, that the federal government is trying to get ahead of cloud computing, or at least embrace it quickly, and put standards out there that would help all of us in the federal space, again, accelerate our adoption into cloud computing. That will necessarily, and already does necessarily, include certain security standards.
Yeah, just one last point is FedRAMP also was another document that they published, and some of that is actually addressing data leaving the United States and what the rules are around that for a .gov and a .mil, so it was helpful.
There's another question over there, Justin.
Yeah, I think you already addressed it, but the security of the cloud providers themselves, is that part of what you're dealing with?
The security of the cloud providers themselves?
Right.
Oh, absolutely. Depending on the space, whether you're a public company or a public organization or an industry provider, you are going to want to do due diligence checking on the provider that you select. In the space that I operate in the intelligence community space and in the Department of Defense space, Jamie mentioned some of the FISMA requirements and your ability to protect things at a high, moderate, or low level for us. We're also going to look at, just from a supply chain and a foreign ownership or controlling interest perspective, we're going to look at U.S. companies.
And physical location as
well. Oh yeah, we're going to, yes, absolutely.
Where is it? You know, what are your power
capabilities?
You know, what are your environmentals there? Do you have the ability to keep it? I mean, the infrastructure is only good if it's up. So, you know, is there enough power, enough cooling?
The Cloud Security Alliance does have a list of controls and checklists that you could go through when you're evaluating a cloud provider. So I'd recommend referencing them.
So for this next question, I'll address to the panel, so whoever wants to grab it, please do. Should technologies be developed to allow for tagging location and path of data in transit or at rest within the clouds or among the clouds? Does anybody have a strong opinion on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have solutions today in our portfolio that look at data loss prevention and the ability to tag data and classify it inside your organization. And so we're actively looking at how do we solve that Dropbox problem, to be able to classify it and tag that data when it moves out into Dropbox, be able to control who could view that and essentially secure that environment once the document has left. So it's something that we're actively working on.
For the next question, let's talk about, I'm sorry, did anybody else want to add to that? Okay. For the next question, lessons learned on migrating to the cloud and the true savings, and then maybe talk about the deltas and gaps that you have seen. So
want to start, Jill?
Yeah, I'll start it, and then you guys can add on, because you've obviously seen a lot more customers do a migration. This was referred to earlier by Jamie on the applications migration. I think that as you move to a cloud environment, there is no more perfect opportunity to go through the pain of a complete one-to-end apps inventory. And you will achieve so many things. Not only will you find out the applications that have very low utilization and you can question whether you should move them, and not only will you find the applications that are amazingly complex and might not ever get moved into the cloud environment, but you will also find those applications that are not exhibiting the good hygiene that they need to. You'll find those applications that have security gaps and holes, and it will give you a chance to plug those security challenges and issues before you move them to the cloud. And then, of course, you can always use cloud migration on your applications as an opportunity to push further into SOA, into services-oriented architectures, and dissecting your applications to move them, for us to move them out of their entire stovepipe, they built it all, to something where they actually take advantage of services across the organization and reduce some of the complexity of the applications over time.
I think another key area to be aware of is, as you migrate piecemeal, your environment into the cloud, how do you continue to enforce access and control that identity management? And so making sure that it's integrated back with your on-premise identity and access management solution, so that once the application's moved outside of your organization, the right access controls are still in place.
Kristin, thought, Kristin?
The only thing I was going to say is it's interesting because most of our migration is less about migration, and it's more about the development and delivery of new business services, better ways to do the same thing. So it's less about taking legacy infrastructure or applications and migrating them. And so I think there is definitely an opportunity as you're sort of thinking through where am I going, how am I doing this, what am I moving. I think there's a very good opportunity to take advantage of the new technologies. One thing that we haven't said explicitly but need to say is, when you are migrating your workloads over to the cloud, when the cloud provider offers you security services, please take them. Really, please take them. There's this assumption that it just happens magically. It doesn't happen magically. So make sure, to the question, how do you assess your provider? Sit down with the provider and ask them, what are you providing me, right? Are you providing me with forensic analysis? Like, for instance, if I get compromised, are you going to tell me? A lot of providers won't actually tell you. Yeah. Are you going to do assessments? Are you monitoring me? Some providers deliberately won't, because they want you to be able to host whatever you want to host. So, make sure that you really understand what it is that they're offering to you before you sign up for it, and take the security services when they are offered.
Yeah, it's a great point. And if you do want them to do it, they, as a provider, I can tell you that if they haven't signed permission for access to look at their data and things like that, you're moving into privacy. So that was a great point. The other thing that I'd like to bring up for lessons learned of moving over to the cloud is the workforce, and we touched on it a little bit, but if you take somebody that used to buy servers, install them, have to maintain them, make sure the power, the cooling, all that stuff that we talked about, is now going to be looking at a dashboard that's actually going to give them visibility that they didn't have before. They're going to know the utilization of every single server in that environment. You are really asking somebody that was, very traditional in this regard to move into a role of an operator that is IA, IS, and IT all in one. And so I know some of the lessons learned from some of the environments that we've worked with is that their workforce wasn't necessarily ready for that. They thought that they could just take some of the guys in IT and move them into that role of spinning up servers when they want them, whether it's for R&D or whatever the applications are, and actually actively monitoring. And there's even a billing portion of that. You know, you can actually run bills for whoever's on, you know, what portion of the infrastructure. So the workforce definitely is something that you have to look at.
There's a question, Jeremy?
There is time. If there is time for you to also summarize, there's another
we have
question.
time for a question, yes.
It's on.
Hello? Okay. Do you believe that a centralized SIM solution will continue to be relevant and possible as enterprises and government agencies move to the cloud?
Who wants to grab that? Centralized what solution? Could you go ahead and repeat it one more time?
So essentially, security information management service? Yes. Absolutely. Unquestionably. Both from a provider and a subscriber perspective, absolutely. I think the biggest difference, though, that you're going to see is that the data sources that you're going to be pulling from are going to be a little bit different. Particularly when you're talking about things like desktop cloud. Another, you know, I know I used the bubonic plague example. I'm going to give you one that's going to really scare you now. So in this room, let's say we have 400 people. In this room, I'm sure Jill can bear with me on this, about 10% of you, if you've got a corporate-owned laptop that you've been using, 10% of you have a botnet on your machine that's not detectable. If you've brought your own IT to work, you're using your own personal machine, 30% of you have a botnet that's been detected. And so what that hasn't been detected. Now what that means from a centralized a SIM solution is that new agents are going to be pushed down into the infrastructure that are going to begin to look for anomalous activity. And that anomalous activity is going to be pushed up into a cloud. And in fact, the reason why you have to have a SIM in a cloud is because you have to be able to look at the reputation of the sites that are being touched and command and control sites where the bots are talking to. If you don't have that in a cloud, you really don't have the visibility. And so I think, you know, vendors, you know, particularly vendors like Verizon, are in really good position to be able to see a lot of that kind of activity because they're in front of the circuit and they can get that visibility.
Right, and the infrastructure, and you've got to correlate it. Yeah. And that really is, it goes back to the white paper of how you really do have an opportunity to do it better.
Yeah.
So it will be relevant, it's just going to have to evolve to address cloud needs on top of what it already does today.
So I think we have time for one final question. I want to end it on a futures note. What are the most promising technologies that you're seeing that could enhance cloud security, and also any promising business models that are disruptive that could enhance security? And we'll just open that to the panel.
Okay, I can just name a couple real quick. I think VM Shield, VM Safe, those are all products that are going to be very introspective to the visualization of what's going on inside the cloud. I also had mentioned this earlier, memory forensics inside the infrastructure is immature for some companies, and we watch this quite a bit. We actually have a capability like that, and it's just amazing, but something that you're going to have to do. And from a disruptive technology, I would name, there's a company called Joyent, right, Jill? So these guys are looking at, cloud infrastructure without a hypervisor. And the reason for that is, applications like, or companies like gaming, some of the Oracle financials, really tough to put in a cloud environment. And so it's driving some of the hybrids where you're having them on servers and then cross-connecting them into the cloud. But they're actually looking at clouds without hypervisors. And so I think that that's definitely going to be disruptive, obviously, and something that we should all watch the next couple years.
I think for me, the most disruptive technology, going back to the SIM point, is the application of predictive analytics in the cloud. And so, one of the things, as well as post-facto forensic analysis in the cloud. Now imagine, an image gets, I'm a provider and one of my images is compromised. I get a call from the FBI saying you're attacking somebody. Well, which image is it? I don't know. It takes a long time to figure that out. And then how do you analyze it? And how do you run it through the test? So I think the technologies that help you very quickly identify the breached asset and then do, the memory-based analysis to figure out what happened, where it happened, when it happened, and stop it. Yeah. That's important, as well as the cloud-based blocking and tackling that's going to happen by new DNS monitoring, new SIM technologies, et cetera. That's going to be the real big news, I think, for us within the next 3 to 5 years.
I think for what we're looking at today, it's how do we make security better for the cloud, leveraging identity, so understanding who that person is, what device they're on, what location they are in. So if I'm in the headquarters and I'm accessing our network from my laptop, my permissions are a lot different than if I'm on an Android device in a coffee shop in a third world country trying to log into the network. So being able to understand context and apply that to cloud security, we think that's definitely a way to move security forward and make the cloud better.
Great.
I think there are a lot of them out there. I've already talked to you about encryption and some of the breakthroughs we need from a technology perspective to encrypt large forms of data. I also, building on the identity and access management and knowing who you are, where you are, what you have, and what you want, it will be very important. It means that our data has to go to smart data. That's the terminology that we're now using for it. It's not just about big data, but it's about smart data. Data that in the cloud, in and of itself, is defensive enough and understands itself enough to know that you can serve it up in that coffee house in a third world country, or you can't. You can only serve it up in a SCIF environment that can handle top secret information or something. And being able to have those smart data technologies combined with strong identity and access management and authorization services on top of the cloud will actually allow us to take greatest advantage of the capabilities that are there with cloud computing.
Great, thank you. So that will actually conclude our session today. I want to thank our panelists so much for their contributions and sharing their expertise with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, panel, and thank you, audience. As I say, we're going to keep this interactive spirit. Let's just give Jocelyn the chance to remind us of the URL for the CloudNOW network, Jocelyn.
It's cloudnetworkofwomen.com, and registration is open to any women in cloud. I welcome you to come.
How simple is that?
Thank you.
There you are, call to action. So stay in your seats. As I say, keep interactive. We're going to move from security now to enterprise cloud best